for coming. How many of you were here last week to get some sense of how many weren't here last week? Okay. So I guess a brief recap in order. Boom. Thank you.
You're going to get a little more taste.
Do you have balloons?
We don't have a balloon in this computer. Basically what I tried to do in the limited amount of time we had was introduce some of the elements of the modern picture of scientific cosmology and why it is thought that these elements are a fairly sound basis for understanding where the universe came from and possibly where it's going. Essentially, I discussed the expansion of the universe, the fact that it's expanding, and in as much as anything in science can be considered a fact, that the universe is expanding seems to fall under the category of scientific fact because of the existence of the cosmological redshift, that is, that all of the galaxies that we see appear to be speeding away from us in proportion to their distance away from us. They seem to be moving away from us. The fact that that we can see physically in the sky the afterglow of some early dense state for the universe, and this afterglow radiation, called the cosmic microwave background radiation, is detectable in both ground-based and satellite experiments. And the spectrum of this radiation, that is the various frequencies of this radiation, conform exactly to what one would expect to see after several billion years of their very dense state cooling off. The spectrum of radiation conforms exactly to what one would see. That's the second main piece of evidence for the Big Bang, as it's called. And the third piece is the existence of the elemental abundances in the universe. That is, the universe appears to be made mostly of hydrogen, about 75%, about 23% helium or so, and the rest trace elements. And this particular ratio of elements is well described by the theory of the Big Bang, because the hydrogen and the helium would have been produced to about that proportion in an early universe. So these are some of the observational bases for the Big Bang theory. The current theory also indicates that this expansion, although this expansion began at some finite time in the past, and the theory doesn't say anything specifically about what happened before that point, although it began at a finite time in the past, around 15 billion years, plus or minus several billion years, not a very exact number, it appears to the present sort of generation of scientists who are working in the field, the data seems to indicate that this expansion will continue indefinitely. Another way of saying this is that the amount of mass in the universe is not sufficient to pull the universe back together after this initial explosion of the Big Bang. The only reason it would sort of turn around and then recollapse would be if there were a sufficient amount of matter so that the combined gravitational attraction would tend to make the universe recollapse. And that doesn't seem to be the case. So the universe is expanding, and it looks like it's going to continue to expand as long as the universe is going to be around. The theory of the Big Bang, particularly of the very first moments of the Big Bang, is a very rich theory. There are a lot of different phases, a lot of different events, significant events on a sort of atomic level that happen in just the very first 3 minutes of the Big Bang. And in the very first fractions of a second of the Big Bang, very interesting things happen also, because it is during this time that the expansion itself becomes explained, at least theoretically, through what's known as inflation theory, which purports to explain several things at once: the expansion of the universe in the first place, and also the degree of homogeneity of the universe. That is, if the universe has been expanding for a very long time, one would expect that there would have been a very long time available for the various bits of matter to cluster together and clump together. And in particular, one would expect the universe to be a lot clumpier than it actually is when you look out there. When you look very far out in all directions, you see it's pretty much, on large scales, extremely homogeneous, extremely smooth, that is. And this smoothness is also something that can be explained by inflation theory. Another thing that inflation theory does is it opens up the possibilities for the sorts of things which might have happened before the Big Bang, quote unquote, or parallel to the Big Bang. In other words, certain versions of inflation theory suggest that the visible universe and everything beyond, basically whatever occupies our sort of space-time continuum that we reside in, could perhaps only be one expanding bubble in any number of other infinite bubbles that are also expanding. In other words, there could be other parallel universes that we would not even in principle have any observational access to, and therefore their existence, as long as we're in this world, has to remain purely theoretical. So these are some of the elements of modern cosmology. I want to take a few minutes before moving into some speculations about the Baha'i teachings and their relationship to all this. Take a few minutes and shift the focus away from the realm of the very large back down to the realm of the very, very small. And actually the connection between the two happened in the very first moments of the Big Bang, because in these first few seconds, the density of matter was so high that the way to describe what's going on is in terms of the nuclear physics and the subatomic physics and so forth. So cosmology is usually thought to be the science of the very large galaxies and so forth, but a part of cosmology actually involves itself quite intimately with the realm of the very small. In this realm, we find a profusion of subatomic particles, whose numbers seem to be increasing with time. That is, the discovery of these particles seems to be every decade more particles seem to come to light. Originally, it was thought, this is by the ancient Greeks, several hundred BC, that everything was made of particles. This is an idea of Democritus, and so the notion of a particulate view of matter is very old, but it wasn't placed upon a strong scientific footing until fairly recently, in the last 100 or so years, when it was shown that matter is made up of atoms. And then it was later shown that these atoms, as most of you probably know, are comprised of a nucleus with electrons orbiting this nucleus. It was later found that the orbiting of the electrons is actually just an approximation, because electrons don't really orbit. They sort of occupy these probability clouds around the electrons, according to the laws of quantum mechanics. The nucleus they orbit around is comprised of protons and neutrons. So it was thought for a time that all matter essentially was made of protons, neutrons, and electrons, and that depending on the number of protons in the nucleus, you would have various elements. One proton corresponds to a hydrogen atom, and two protons corresponds to a helium atom. That is, two protons with the appropriate number of neutrons, and that the element is determined by the number of protons in the nucleus. not so many decades ago, it was discovered that these protons and neutrons themselves are not elementary particles, but rather are comprised of particles even smaller. And at this point, the word particle has to be sort of understood in quotation marks, because they're particles in one sense, but they all have wave-like properties, and they can't really be isolated and observed independently as particles. I'm speaking here of quarks. How many people have heard of quarks? Just okay. All right. So it was later then found that that nuclear matter, the protons and neutrons, were made of quarks. A proton was made up of two up quarks and a down quark, and a neutron was made up of two down quarks and an up quark. Some scientists who invented these had, something sense of humor, or at least some sense of artistic flair in the naming of these elementary particles, because all nuclear matter is essentially made up of what are called up and down quarks. We don't need to get into exactly what they are and how they're described, but suffice it to say that besides up and down quarks, it was later discovered that there's another parallel family of quarks which were called charm and strange. So you have charm quarks and strange quarks. And then somewhat later it was found that there was a third family of quarks, again very similar in properties, but each family is more massive than the family before it. And these two quarks were called, depending on who you ask, either truth and beauty or top and bottom. In physics notation, you just write T and D anyway, so what you call it is a little bit irrelevant. But so these then became the fundamental alphabet of most matter. Aside from this, of course, you still have your electrons, and electrons, just as the protons, which are comprised of up and down quarks, just as these up and down quarks have sort of cousins or sort of family members of higher mass, and there are three families of these. So also electrons have two cousins of higher mass, and these are called muons and tau particles. And the electrons have, and I'm just sort of naming the particles here, just so you get a sense of the scope of this particle zoo, that the electrons have partners massless, or it was once thought were massless, called particles called neutrinos, which travel at or near the speed of light, and they travel through many miles worth of solid lead, and they won't be stopped because they interact very weakly with matter. And these neutrinos, so you have the electrons and their associated neutrinos, and the up and down quark. That's sort of the first family of matter. And then the second family, you have charm and strange quarks, and you have the muons, and then you have the muon neutrinos. And in the third family, you have truth and beauty, and you have the tau particles and the tau neutrinos. Then aside from, so everything is sort of comprised of this, and there's a whole, a real impressive array of particles that can be created from various combinations of these, which are all created and seen almost exclusively in artificially created circumstances in particle detectors. Aside from these particles, one has, for each one of these particles, an associated antiparticle. In other words, for every up quark, there's also an anti-up, and every electron has an anti-electron associated with it. And these antiparticles really do exist. They're not just theoretical. They've been observed. They have measurable properties and so forth. So you have, in a sense, what I'm trying to give a picture of is a whole lot of particles, but there are certain ways in which these particles can be organized into families. You have three families. You have the sort of the up and the down pairing off. You have the electrons and their associated neutrinos pairing off. You have the particles sort of pairing off with the antiparticles. So you can sort of construct almost a grid of different fundamental particles, and you can slice this grid in various ways and see that this grid is really can be reduced to various families. So there's some sort of internal structure to it. The reason for this is not yet quite clear. In terms of the fundamental physics, it's not yet entirely clear why there have to be three families of these particles, why there's matter and antimatter, and so on and so forth. Now, to add a little bit of complication to this, if it's not complicated already, what I've just described is sort of the matter end of things. Now, there's one can think of there being two pillars to existence, for lack of a better word, in physics, and you have the sort of the particles that carry mass, and well, carrying mass is not even a good description of it. Basically, the particles that are thought of as comprising matter, and then you have the particles which are said to be the carriers of the force. And these particles, and I'll name them just for sake of completeness, photons, that is light rays, are particles in a sense. They're also waves at the same time, but we don't have time to get into that. Photons are the carriers of the electromagnetic force. You have other forces, you have three other forces too, because there are four fundamental forces, only one of which I really got into last week, and that was the force of gravity. And the carriers of the gravitational force are called gravitons. Very interesting objects. They have a very high quantum spin, and they've never actually been detected because they interact. Again, the interaction with matter is very weak, but they're in the theory. Associated, and then you have two more forces left, and these forces are called the strong and the weak nuclear force. And the particles associated with the weak nuclear force are called the W particles and the Z naughts. And I guess they ran out of invented naming them. And the carriers of the strong nuclear force are called gluons, and gluons come in 8 different colors. So you have, on the one hand, you have this massive particles and sort of that form the fundamental alphabet of matter, and then you have these other particles which have somewhat different properties which mediate the forces. In other words, whatever causes two objects to be attracted to each other, in terms of quantum mechanics, the reason why they're attracted to each other is because they're exchanging one of these force-carrying particles. Now, the fundamental difference, one of the ways and it may not be that useful way of thinking of it practically, but one of the differences between the matter particles and the force-carrying particles is that all the matter particles have a quantum spin of 1/2, and all the force-carrying particles have a quantum spin of 1, or in the case of gravitons of 2, or in the case of photons of 0, basically an integer spin, and the matter particles have a half-integer spin. So there's ways, again, of slicing all these different particles into different families, and that's the main picture I wanted to give. But also I wanted to give the picture that it's sort of a mess. It's sort of, you would hope maybe that ultimately when you look at the fundamental constituents of things that you're just going to come down to one fundamental substance and one fundamental law. But that hasn't been the case yet. Perhaps it is the case. Hopefully it is the case. No one knows for sure yet. But because no one really is satisfied with the picture of the universe as it currently exists in theoretical physics, because it's too complicated, it's too messy, and everyone has a deep conviction that ultimately reality has to be simple. And ultimately a theory is going to be found that shows that all of these four forces are really manifestations of a single force, and that all of these matter particles are really manifestations of a single kind of matter. The theory that's describing that doesn't yet exist in fully fleshed out form, but an outline of it and hints towards it do exist, and they're embodied in a theory which is called superstring theory. How many people have heard the word superstring theory? String theory. Okay, string theory. It's a fairly recent phenomenon, and I'll just briefly mention it. Essentially, it came about. The roots of it go a little bit far back. not far back, but sort of like the 60s. But it really didn't come into its own as a sort of branch of theoretical physics until the early 80s. Dr. Arbab, actually, our Dr. Arbab, worked on some theoretical physics which was the foundation or some of the foundational work behind superstrings, behind what eventually evolved into string theory. S matrices and Rayleigh poles and so forth. High level theoretical stuff. Superstring theory essentially takes as its starting point the notion that really there's no such thing as, or rather that particles, as we conceive them as being these separate entities that sort of interact through other particles, that this is really an approximation. And that really, if you were able to look closely enough at what you think are particles, they're really not particles, but they are loops of string. In other words, reality at its sort of fundamental level is not zero-dimensional points, but rather one-dimensional objects called strings. And these objects may be closed loops. They may be open strings that are attached to membranes, and membranes are these two-dimensional sheets which also arise from the theory. You have n-branes, you have branes as they're called, B-R-A-N-E-S, branes in various dimensions which enter into the theory. I'm no expert on the theory, so I can't say anything really in detail about it, except that the basic idea is that the building blocks of reality are these one-dimensional objects. What differentiates then, say, an up quark from a down quark, or an electron from an electron neutrino, that was always sort of a problem, a philosophical problem. It's not a practical problem, but a philosophical problem in the current theory of physics. Because if an electron is really a point particle, and if a down quark is really a point particle, then how can the electron really be different from a down quark? If you're just talking about a point, then how can one point be different from another point? What you end up doing is assigning quantum numbers to it, and it's these quantum numbers which are different, and so you have a mathematical way of describing how it's different. But if you think about what makes one point different from another point, that's sort of an unresolved question. In string theory, the resolution is the problem gets pushed back to another question. That is, well, what is the string made of? What is this one-dimensional? But setting that aside for the moment, it deals very nicely with the problem of how one particle is different from the other particle. And that is, it claims that different particles represent different vibrational modes in this one-dimensional string. So you can pluck a guitar string, say, and it's going to vibrate at a particular frequency. Or you could put your finger in the middle and pluck it again and get a higher harmonic of that guitar string. Anyone who's played guitar, you can sometimes tune a little bit easier that way. So you can get more than one frequency out of a single guitar string. The guitar string actually can vibrate at all sorts of frequencies. It's typically the dominant frequency that you hear, but there are overtones also that the string is capable of vibrating in. And so one can then, by analogy, say that according to string theory, these different families of particles that I was describing, this sort of next heavier family and then the heaviest family, these three families then would represent higher overtones in this sort of fundamental string stuff of the universe. Okay, so enough on that. Are there any questions up to this point? The part of the reason for sort of giving this explanation is not really to clarify things in the sense of coming away with, oh, is that really how it works? Because no one really knows how it really works. All that people have is the alphabet. All that people have is the letters. And they don't really know how to put these letters together into words. This is, I think, where the Baha'i teachings come in a sense. And by analogy, we can take ourselves back to the 1700s in Egypt. And the pyramids of Egypt and the hieroglyphics inscribed upon the Egyptian monuments and painted within the walls of the tombs and the pyramids and elsewhere has fascinated people for centuries. But up until the early 1800s, their meaning was a complete mystery. People had spent lifetimes of research collecting the various scraps of parchment and copying down these hieroglyphs and constructing alphabets of hieroglyphs and coming up with observations which were true about these hieroglyphs, but no one knew what they meant. They could, for instance, say that there's a fundamental vocabulary of X number of hieroglyphs and that they tend to have these sorts of shapes, and that if you look on a wall of hieroglyphs, you'll find that some tend to follow others, and some of them tend to come in combinations, and so forth. And so at the level of looking at each individual hieroglyph, they could say a lot of interesting things. These interesting things may not have that much meaning, but they could say a lot of true statements about the basic makeup of the Egyptian hieroglyphic language. So this was the situation in Egypt until 1799, when by chance someone found in a field this big black, not that big, maybe about this high, I think black basalt stone with a flat face with a bunch of writing inscribed on it. And it was found near the town of Rosetta, I think, was the name of the town. The name of the stone is, of course, the Rosetta Stone. And inscribed upon this stone was a message written by, I think, Ptolemy V in around 200 BC or so. Not a very interesting message, just sort of some pharaonic edict or other. But the interesting thing about it was that it was inscribed in Egyptian hieroglyphics and Demotic script, which was a sort of a simplified Egyptian, and then underneath it, Greek. Now everyone knew how to read Greek, at least the scholars knew how to read Greek, and so from the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, it was only a few years before someone was able to unlock the meaning of these hieroglyphs, which until then had remained a complete enigma. But it took the Rosetta Stone to understand what the meaning of these hieroglyphs were. So you can probably predict what I'm going to say next, and that is that the Baha'i teachings I will propose represent the Rosetta Stone of the physical world. That is, in the same way that prior to their appearance, prior to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, that is, all that was known about hieroglyphs was the sort of fundamental alphabet and a few rules about how hieroglyphs may have fit together and which ones tended to be grouped together. In the same way, the situation in the physics world today is that we are faced with different families of particles and an assortment of different force laws and a whole lot of rules and relationships that sort of join them together, and to which people can fruitfully spend their entire lives sort of delving into and making very true and accurate observations about, which deepen the understanding about the interrelationships of these various elements. But so far, the meaning of the alphabet of the universe is, as yet, it has not yet been read, so to speak. Or it has been read by various religions in the past, but to varying degrees of clarity. And today, in this day, that is, for the first time, it's possible to read with unprecedented clarity the book of creation. And it's through the aid of the written book, that is the book of Revelation, which is the Rosetta Stone that enables one to unlock the secrets of the book of creation. Abdu'l-Baha in a tablet, and this is cited, quoted by Bahia Naqshbandi in her book Response. It's just a little bit of a tablet that she had authorized with the translation and published here. The only place that we can find it. Abdu'l-Baha says there are two books. One is the book of creation, and the other is the written book. The written book consists of the heavenly books which are revealed to the prophets of God and have issued forth from the lips of his manifestations. The book of creation is the preserved tablet and the outspread roll of existence. The book of creation is in accord with the written book. And Baha'u'llah on the tablet of wisdom, and this is in Tablets of Baha'u'llah, page 141, says the following: Look at the world and ponder a while upon it. It unveileth the book of its own self before thine eyes, and revealeth that which the pen of thy Lord, the fashioner, the all-informed, hath inscribed therein. It will acquaint thee with that which is within it and upon it, and will give thee such clear explanations as to make thee independent of every eloquent expounder. So we have a specific idea in the Baha'i writings of the universe being a book. And it's comprised of words and letters. And one could say that the words and letters of this book are the various elements of the physical universe that scientists are busy discovering and investigating the relationships of. But what science is not doing is reading the meaning of this book. It's as if science, another way of looking at it perhaps, is that science is sort of like the grammar of the book of creation. It's sort of, or even more than the grammar, it's sort of, the scientists are like the people who are looking at a book and sort of looking at how you spell things and the rules for spelling, and they're looking at how you draw the letters themselves, and they're looking at how you put together a sentence in terms of subject-verb agreement, and so on and so forth. These are all very useful and very critical things, and you can't really understand the book, in its totality, perhaps unless you understand the grammar and these other fundamental things. But science doesn't sort of go to the next point of reading the meaning out of the words that are written in this book. And it's the book of Revelation that sort of provides that key for understanding the book of creation. So, any questions or comments at this point? So what is, and who can say at this point, at this very early stage in humanity's encounter with the Word of God, who can really say what the overall meaning is? What's the meaning of these sentences? What's the big picture of why the universe is here? Something within which the Big Bang and string theory and everything have naturally fit in and have a place and are recognized for their truth, but within which these various physical theories take on a certain meaning that transcends the sorts of detailed observations of which they consist. I'll take a stab just for the sake of putting forward an idea, and propose that the ultimate meaning is unity. And this idea has to be fleshed out a little bit. In particular, it has to be fleshed out in the context of statements in the writings about why the universe was created in the first place. And for this, we can go to the Kitab-i Aqdas, and this is not in the Aqdas itself, but in one of the notes to the Aqdas. Baha'u'llah refers in the Aqdas to the hidden treasure. And he states, he makes an allusion to it. And if you go to the note that describes this, and this is on page 185 of the Akhdaq, it turns out that Baha'u'llah was referring to an Islamic tradition known as the Hadith of the Hidden Treasure, which has gotten quite a bit of mileage by the Islamic mystics, and it has formed really the basis of a whole way of looking at the world. This Islamic tradition goes as follows: I was a hidden treasure, and I love to be known. Therefore, I brought creation into being that I might become known. These two sentences have been the subject of endless speculation and theorizing. Abdu'l-Baha himself, in his teenage years, was asked by Baha'u'llah to compose a treatise describing this Hadith of the Hidden Treasure. And he did so, and we have this very long, very deep, very complex tablet from his pen, which has not yet been appeared in an authorized translation, but which contains a great deal of interesting information. One of the about this tradition, and one of the things it does is it parses this tradition into four parts. The first part is regarding the hidden treasure, and the second part is regarding loving to be known, or love. The third part is bringing creation into being, or creation, and the fourth part is becoming known, becoming known by the preacher, or knowledge. So to repeat it, I was a hidden treasure, and I love to be known. Therefore, I brought creation into being that I might become known. This is one way of understanding sort of the big picture, that you have an ineffable, transcendent reality that desires to be known. Therefore, creation comes into being through its agency. And the purpose of that creation coming into being is that it should then, in a sense, turn around and recognize its creator. Abdu'l-Baha put this idea, this basic idea, in other terms, in some answered questions. And this is on page 285 of some answered questions, where he states that it is an established and deep theological proposition that the material worlds are terminated at the end of the arc of descent, and that the condition of man is at the end of the arc of descent and at the beginning of the arc of ascent, which is opposite to the supreme center. Also, from the beginning to the end of the arc of ascent, there are numerous spiritual degrees. The arc of descent is called beginning, and that of ascent is called progress. So we have an image of almost a circle of existence, if you will, comprised of two arcs. Our sort of human reality is here at the bottom of the arc, but the first half of the arc comes into being through the overflowing love of God for creation. It's an emanation of His light. It makes its appearance in successive degrees, and these degrees are the kingdoms of existence that we're familiar with from the writings. The entire purpose of this arc of descent is the appearance of the human reality, the rational soul, not necessarily human in the sense of our human species on this earth, but rather the rational soul in the sense of creatures capable of knowing God. In other words, it's not exclusive of life on other worlds, for instance, also having the potentiality of this rational soul. So the entire purpose of the arc of descent everywhere in the universe then is the creation of this rational soul, and that its purpose in turn is to complete the circle, in a sense, by ascending the arc of descent and gaining reunion with its creator. So how does this relate to what I was saying before? That unity can be seen as that sort of fundamental concept that is the key that unlocks the big picture of things. Unity is essentially, or how does unity arise? Unity arises through the attraction of two things. They're brought together, they're united. This force of attraction is called love. This unity, just love and unity both, exist all along each level of the arc of descent and the arc of ascent. That is, love does not merely mean love between two people or love between races. Love also, Abdullah has explained, is that supreme magnetic force that directs the motions of the planets in their orbit around the sun. And so he expands the definition of love to include stages of existence which one might not immediately think of as being associated with it. So unity then becomes that ultimate goal which drives the whole circle of creation. You have everything proceeding from God, and the whole purpose of everything is to become united with God. And this unity is achieved through successive levels. If one looks at the evolution of creation from the very beginning, if you start at the Big Bang, and you chart the process of unity. Let's look at unity at all its various levels, starting at the Big Bang. You have initially this sort of hot, dense plasma of energy that eventually coalesces into mostly hydrogen and some helium. Isolated atoms of these elements, just to start with. Or even before that, you have these isolated nuclei and these isolated electrons, and the temperature is so high that they can't even join together. They can't even unite because they'll immediately be torn apart by the intense radiation surrounding them. So the first thing that happens is that things cool down to the point where the electrons can finally unite but unite in the sense of becoming associated with the protons. And then you have hydrogen being born, and then you have some of these protons uniting into helium nuclei, and to this entrance, a couple of neutrons and then a couple of electrons unite, and then you have the helium nuclei. And then later on in time, gravity eventually takes over, and the forces governing the composition of matter become not so much directed by sort of considerations of nuclear and atomic forces, but rather gravity sort of becomes the big player a little bit later. And these hydrogen and helium atoms then end up coalescing into sort of balls of gas. And so this is another stage of unity that's then reached. And this, as the ball of gas contracts enough, finally nuclear burning is ignited, and you have the first stars being born. And these stars essentially burn up the nuclear fuel inside, and the reason why stars glow is because the light of unity, actually. It's the hydrogen atoms in the core of the stars that are united into helium, and in the uniting of two hydrogen into helium, a large amount of energy is released. So one could take Baha'u'llah's statement, so powerful is the light of unity that it can illumine the whole earth, and give it a very literal interpretation. It's literally the light of unity that causes the sun to glow and to illumine the earth. So the next level of unity, past that, you have the sun's sort of further fusing elements within them, because once all the hydrogen is burned up, it has to turn to helium and start burning helium. And the helium then burns up and it unites and it creates higher elements. And so these higher elements then represent the next sort of stages in unity, so to speak. After a while, the star goes nova, it blows up, and these higher elements become sort of scattered in interstellar space. But they end up getting collected and coalescing in other star systems, and a lot of these heavy elements end up becoming basically coalescing into planets around second and third generation stars. So basically everything we see around us, all of the matter we see around us, which is not hydrogen here, it's all the heavier elements, everything we see was born in previous generations of stars. As Carl Sagan says, all of us are stars. So we're all basically made of, every atom in our body is a sort of a burned up remnant of an old star, which then later eventually made its way to our star system, and that's how we got here. Now these planets represent a higher degree of unity, because what happens on these planets is various the conditions are ripe on these various planets for these different elements to combine in various ways. You have water combining in, hydrogen and of course combining to form coalescing and binding with some oxygen and so forth, and you start getting organic molecules. And these organic molecules basically represent a higher level of unity as conditions on this planet continue to be ripe for the production of even more complex organic molecules, and you have these things like amino acids arising and so forth. I'm assuming here the sort of the picture of evolution that we find in science, which I don't think is at odds fundamentally with what the Baha'i writings say. We have, for instance, Abdu'l-Baha describing from the beginning of the universe, really, the gradual coalescing of matter from elementary states into more and more composite forms. If I can find this quotation, very interesting. It's from Some Answered Questions, page 181. And listen if this doesn't sound like the sort of thing I'm describing, which is what the scientists are also saying. In the beginning there was a single matter, and that one matter appeared in a particular form in each element. Thus various forms were produced, and these various forms, as they were produced, became permanent, and each element was specialized. But this independence was not definite and did not attain realization and perfect existence until after a very long time. Then these elements became composed, organized, and combined in infinite forms. In other words, from the composition and combination of these elements, a limitless number of beings appeared. From the composition and combination of elements, from their decomposition, from their measure, and from the effect of other beings upon them, resulted forms, endless realities, and innumerable beings. And this is Some Answered Questions, page 101. So Abdu'l-Baha himself describes a gradual process in which things were in the beginning in a very simple state, but then became more and more complex as different forms, different compositions arose. Eventually, life itself arose from these combinations of complex organic molecules. How exactly it arose is still a mystery, I think. But it did arise and gradually complexified itself. Through the course of evolution, life became ever more complex. Complexity represents a higher degree of unity. So we find throughout this whole process of cosmic evolution, unity sort of appearing at successively higher and higher stages. Ultimately, the complexity reached such a degree that it enabled certain degrees of spiritual power, I'll say, that become manifest. And the first one that became manifest was the power of growth. That is, life itself, of course, embodies the power of growth. It propagates itself, it grows. Abdu'l-Baha associates the power of growth with the vegetable spirit. He sort of gives it a name. He says the vegetable spirit is the power of growth. Further process of evolution and further complexification of organisms eventually led to the enabling of the expression of an even higher form of spiritual power, and that was the power of the senses, which was represented in the animal kingdom, and ultimately also the power of the rational soul, which was the highest sort of level of any individual composition on this planet. So the rational soul then is enabled to come into being through the very complexity of the elements that comprise the being in which the rational soul has its seat. But the unity, the process of unity, does not end there, because these different entities gather together to form other associations, and the most basic association is the family unit. And these family units also coalesce into larger units of the town and the village and the city-state and so forth. And what we're witnessing in this day is the ultimate sort of coalescence of life on this planet into the highest degree of unity conceivable on planet Earth, and that is the ultimate emergence of global civilization. So one that can see global civilization in a very cosmic sense as being the ultimate sort of very tip of that arrowhead of progress, of evolution that began the moments after the Big Bang and are finally on this planet achieving its culmination today. So that's one way of understanding unity as being one of the fundamental ideas that gives meaning to what otherwise would be a rather meaningless alphabet of forces and particles and processes and the Big Bang and everything else. What makes sense of it all, or one way of making sense of it all, because there may well be other ways of looking at it, is to see things in terms of God's desire to be known, that this desire manifests itself in this arc of descent and this arc of ascent, and that all along this process you see an upbuilding of unity. So are there any questions or comments on that? There's more. There's a lot more I could say, but this is sort of a natural place to stop, because everything else there's a tremendous amount more which is said in the writing about the universe and about the processes in the universe, about motion and evolution and attraction and interconnectedness of all things and so forth, all of which are at once spiritual principles and at the same time have application to the physical world. One finds, actually, as Abdu'l-Baha states very clearly in a number of places, that the spiritual world, this is actually in Promulgation of Universal Peace, page 10, that the spiritual world is like unto the phenomenal world. They are the exact counterpart of each other. Whatever objects appear in this world of existence are the outer pictures of the world of heaven. So then the notion of unity, which is thought of as being a spiritual principle, has a counterpart. It's being one of the fundamental ideas, the fundamental sort of motivating forces in the spiritual world. It has a counterpart in the physical world, and that counterpart can be seen in the unfoldment of an evolution of life. so also with a number of other principles in the writings. If you find any idea, any spiritual idea in the writings, you can often think about how a counterpart of that may exist in the physical world. It's a very interesting exercise to do. So that's about all I have to say for tonight. And I think it's a good place to stop in that. Anyone else have any thoughts? Yeah?
42, right?
42. Yeah.
Formulate this question right there. You were saying on the Ark of Ascending Haifa, other worlds that coexist or be there at the same time.
Other worlds.
Other worlds of God.
Well, just from what I was saying earlier about parallel universes and so forth.
Well, no, that's not the bubble.
Yeah, something else.
It's more forward, when you were talking about the Ark of Ascending Haifa.
Yeah. So what specifically about?
And I think you were mentioning something about not only this world, physical world, but also other worlds.
I want to take the saying that's not the same. How could it? Rephrase the question because.
She's talking about the approach to God and the Ark of Ascending.
Yeah. That represent different.
The stages of worlds. Is that what you're saying? I'm reading into it.
or maybe you were talking about different applications of that theory.
Yeah. Let me read something else that I think will address this tangentially, but brings up another interesting and I think somewhat fundamental point, and that is that from one point of view, the language of the spiritual and the physical, it's a very useful way of looking at reality in a number of ways. Say that we have a physical being, but we also have a spiritual reality, and of course, the writings are replete with these sorts of references and this sort of view. From another point of view, reality itself, ultimately, the sort of ground of reality, transcends the distinction between spiritual and physical. That is, when we talk about different worlds, ultimately there's only one world. Ultimately there's only one reality. And what we call the spiritual or the physical, at a certain level, actually is a relative truth. We have this actually from the pen of Abdul Baha, who in one of his tablets, and this tablet is called the Tablet of the Universe, in which he undertakes a monumental explanation of the universe. He has this to say, that earthly and heavenly, material and spiritual, accidental and essential, particular and universal, structure and foundation, appearance and reality, and the essence of all things both inward and outward, all of these are connected with one another and are interrelated in such a manner that you will find that drops are patterned after seeds and that atoms are structured after suns in proportion to their capacities and potentialities. Universal and particular are in reality incidental and relative considerations. So at sort of top level, one could say, the kinds of distinctions that we're accustomed to thinking, the kinds of categories that we're accustomed to placing things in, ultimately dissolve and become relative. And physical and spiritual, I think, are one of these poles of reality, which on a day-to-day basis is a very useful reality, a very useful distinction to make. But when one talks about the ultimate ground of reality, we may not be looking at a strict dualism.
In some answered questions, Abdullah pointed that there are certain laws for both spiritual and physical worlds, and he pointed that all of these creations carry the excellence from the beginning, because a seed carries the excellence to be a mature tree from the beginning. I think our souls here to experience this journey, and then to appreciate the creation, because if there is an appreciation, there is a love. It's my understanding. Our souls here to experience and appreciate, and then to love God. I think understanding.
Very much that our purpose in this world is to derive the fullest spiritual benefits from this world, and not. There's a couple of different philosophies, what sort of overall philosophies that one can take to the world, and one you might call this worldly, and one of them you might call otherworldly. The otherworldly philosophy would be the philosophy of the monks and the ascetics, and those who believe that the true path towards spiritual enlightenment is to cut oneself off as much as possible from the world. And often that means going into some sort of monastic existence or on a mountaintop or something like that. And for many people throughout the ages, that's been the thought about how one should ideally live one's life. I would describe the Baha'i position to be more this worldly, and this worldly doesn't mean one is occupied in an attached sense with the things of this world, but rather that one sees one's purpose in life as being fulfilled through this world, as opposed to in isolation from it. At one and the same time, this means being detached from this world, but one has to live in this world and participate in it, and interact with other people in order for one's purpose in life to be realized. It's interesting to look at the virtues, that we're all enjoying to possess, and most of these virtues, it's hard to imagine one practicing these virtues on a mountaintop. And you see that most virtues are really human virtues. They're virtues of social interaction between people. And how can one acquire these virtues if one is sort of isolated oneself?
Could you talk about a couple of examples from physics or biology that would indicate or support, or in some way maybe serve as evidence for what we call physical and spiritual?
Like an example from biology?
Or physics. I mean, there are a lot of people that write projects to explore spiritual things, and, the new physics community. Do you have any examples in physics that would point the way?
That's a really good question. This opens up a whole topic of discussion for the whole evening. But let me rephrase the question, and that is, we all know that we have a soul, that we have a spiritual reality behind our physical being, and that, but at the same time that we have physical bodies, and that everything we do is in accordance with the laws of nature. We can't break any physical laws. We're sort of constrained by these physical laws. But at the same time, we seem to have the power to do whatever we want. And so there's an interesting fact that we have free will, at least we certainly think we have free will, but at the same time, our bodies, are constrained by the laws of nature, and everything we do physically has to follow these laws, and these laws are fairly deterministic laws. So how is it that one can, at the same time, how can both of these be true at the same time? There are other sorts of examples, and one way of thinking about it is the following: to imagine that reality in its totality is something larger than can fit into the human mind at any given moment in its contemplation. One can think of, say, the human mind as this flat surface, and everything the mind can possibly contain is an image or a two-dimensional figure on this surface. That's sort of the fundamental restriction of the human mind. Now, reality is a three-dimensional thing, like this cup. And this cup, of course, cannot fit onto the paper. But the light of reality, when it shines through this cup onto the mind, the sort of surface of the mind, depending on how this cup is oriented, you're going to see a very different shape on this paper. If the cup is oriented like so, you're going to see a circle in your mind. And then, if at some later time the same cup is rotated just 90 degrees, and the light of reality shines upon it into the receptacle of your mind, you're going to see something that looks like a trapezoid in this case. And if one looks at these two images and it tries to put them together on this two-dimensional sheet, you're going to have a very difficult time. In fact, they're going to seem entirely irreconcilable. And what does the circle have to do with the trapezoid? I mean, one of them has 4 corners. It's made of 4 line segments, and the other one is just this perfectly round thing with any corners at all. How do you get from one to the other? And one could very naturally come to the conclusion that these are 2 very different things, and they must have nothing to do with each other. Only if you see with the eye of insight, which sees into this third dimension, this inner eye that's open when the outer eye is closed, from the hidden words, is one able to perceive this object in all its dimensions at once. And having done that, one understands that really the circle and the trapezoid are the same thing. And that it's only the limitations, the inherent limitations of the mind that leads you to think that these are 2 different objects. Now, once you've seen into the third dimension, and you've seen the 3-dimensional object, you understand now, you've had that insight. Now try to communicate that to someone who has not had the benefit of seeing that, into that other dimension. Try to explain to them that really these 2 are the same things, but if you see it in this, there's no way to describe it. It becomes this ineffable reality. Now, perhaps this is one way of looking at these sorts of questions about the relationship between the spiritual and the physical. That is, perhaps from one point of view, we see things as being results of spiritual forces. We see the actions that we perform as a result of our free will, which is a result of the powers of our rational soul. that's the circle of things. And perhaps someone else, the scientist, the atheist, the materialist, is looking at this same object, but at a different angle, and they're looking at the trapezoid, and they're saying, no, it's a trapezoid, it's not a circle. It's all physical. What is spiritual doesn't have anything to do with it. I don't need this hypothesis of a God, of a spiritual reality, to understand how this, what this trapezoid is. But without understanding that third dimension, you're never going to see that really these two different ways, these two different projections of reality into the human mind are really equivalent. That is, to spell it out more clearly, I guess, that the spiritual way of looking at things may in fact be perfectly equivalent to a materialistic way of describing things, just in terms of laws of physics and cause and effect. There's no reason to think that these two have to be irreconcilable if you just lift your mind into another dimension and say, well, maybe it's just reality is larger than we can understand at any given moment, and perhaps it accommodates both of these points of view simultaneously. So, maybe we should stop there. Thanks for coming back.
Ladies and gentlemen, give him a big hand.